Hey, you made it. So I have some good news and some bad news. The bad news is that smoke simulation, it's very time consuming. I have spent 5 weeks on this tutorial. The good news is that Blender version 3.0 with the experimental build has support for Cycles X. So while we're waiting for the full version 3.0 release, let's check out the alpha version, which is going to speed up our stuff tremendously. The very first thing we're going to do is we're going to save our blend file. So press Ctrl S and then just name this Fireball. And the reason why we're saving this already is because we're going to end up with some smoke bake data. And this data will be saved right next to your blend file. So if you don't save it, it will get in some sort of temporary folder. And we don't want that. We want to see where our smoke save is. So now we've saved our file, let's delete everything by pressing A and then X. And now we're going to create an icosphere, which is going to be our smoke emitter. So go Shift A and create an icosphere. And if you like, you can rename this by double clicking. Let's call it smoke emitter. And now to make this into an actual smoke object, go to Object, Quick Effects, Quick Smoke. And a lot of stuff just happened. First of all, we have a domain object that's surrounding our emitter. And our emitter is now in wireframe view. So you can go to solid view if you like, it's still wireframe. And we have a lot of new interesting stuff happening in the physics properties. Let's say you click the domain. You can hover your mouse over this and see, oh, so that's what the resolution division does. And you can go down to the buoyancy density and you can read that, oh, higher value results in faster rising smoke. I don't think there's any place in Blender where the mouse over text is better than in the smoke simulation settings. And for me personally, I get just super curious when I read like, oh, the noise scale, higher value results in large vortices. And you just get filled up with all this curiosity and it keeps me going. So I recommend checking out all these settings. Before you start clicking anything, just read about it. I highly recommend it. So let's do some actual smoke simulation. Right click on this line down here and go vertical split. And now we're going to set this editor type to properties. So select your domain and go to physics properties. And now you can see we have made a copy of whatever is happening here. So if you click this pin icon, now whatever you do in Blender, whatever you click in Blender, this part of our screen will always stay like this. And that's very good because we'll probably be spending 80% of our time in the physics properties of the smoke domain. So let's make this smoke emitter into a fireball. And you select the smoke emitter and you go to settings, flow type, and you change it from smoke to fire plus smoke. And now when you press play, you have a burning ball. Would you like to make the ball smaller? Okay, so let's select the ball, press S and scale it down. Now when you press play, do you think that this fireball will be smaller? So this next part is a bit confusing in the beginning. Now when we press play, nothing has changed. The smoke domain has not updated. And that is because we did a change to the emitter, not the domain. So to actually update our smoke simulation, all you have to do is just to make a simple change to any of the domain settings. For example, you can increase the resolution division, for example, 34. And now we have our updated smoke simulation. So in the beginning, this is a bit confusing, but I assure you, once you get into it, it's actually a really better way than what it used to be. Okay, so let's make this fireball into a higher quality fireball. And what I mean by that is, let's increase the resolution. Because right now, this is our resolution. This little cube in the corner represents the size of the voxels of our simulation. And we can actually have a look at this if you go to viewport display and set the interpolation to closest. Now you can see that we have this stylistic Minecraft type of smoke. We don't want that, at least for this project. We want a more smooth smoke simulation. By the way, this is just the viewport, this won't affect your render. So let's increase the resolution divisions. Now let's press play. That is a lot slower. I would actually say that's incredibly slow. And that is because even though it's only smoke right here, Blender is calculating everything, everywhere. And we can prevent that because instead of this domain being static, there is a feature called adaptive domain. So if you enable adaptive domain, now you can press play and there's this small box that it will adapt to your simulation. So now we want to animate the emitter. And in my opinion, the fastest way to animate the emitter is to use this real-time animation technique that we covered in this tutorial, so I highly recommend you checking that out. So we're going to start off by clicking the auto keying and then press space and then G. And then let's just do some motion, and there's our animation. Now let's update this by setting the resolution divisions to 62. And there we have some interesting stuff going on. Do you see the problem here? The emitter goes outside the domain. So to see where the domain actually stops, we can just uncheck adaptive domain. And now you can see that, oh, there's our border. So you can scale the domain by select the domain and press S and then X. So we can make it wider. Now let's reset this. Now we can see that our smoke is inside the domain. I think it's a bit weird that the smoke rises to the top. I know that's probably what happens with a real fireball, but let's try and turn off the buoyancy density and the heat. So let's set both of these to 0. And now when we press play, you can see that we're sort of drawing. This is like a 2D, 3D drawing sort of thing. Okay, so one problem I see already is you see these patterns here, sort of like these frame by frame shapes. Each frame, this fireball sort of gets simulated here. And we can fix this by selecting the fireball and under sampling substeps, number of additional samples to take between frames to improve quality of fast moving flows. Perfect. So let's set this to 3, for example. And now let's just change something in the domain. And now when we simulate, we have a much smoother line. And this will be much more visible once we have a more high resolution smoke. So the biggest problem right now, I think, is that we don't have any movement from the emitter that is affecting the smoke. We're sort of just drawing like it's a 2D pen. We want it to be more of a simulation where it is actually smoke being simulated, not just drawn. And there's a very crucial feature that we can enable that just fixes all our problems and just makes this tutorial so much more interesting. So you select the emitter and under initial velocity, where the fluid gets some initial velocity when it is emitted. So click this button and now we have initial velocity, which is multiplied by 1. Let's reset the domain. And now when you press play, look at that. You have a much more organic fireball because the movement is actually being transmitted. So right now I think we're at 24 frames per second. So let's go to the output properties and set our frame rate to 30. And while we're here, let's just set the resolution to 50% because we won't need to do an HD render for this one. So now when we press play, our smoke goes a little bit faster. I feel like I was rushing a little bit when I explained the animation, so let's just do that again. Let's view our emitter from the front and let's enable the auto keying. And to move the emitter, you can press G and then let's press space and G and let's move it like this. The domain is going to look weird. Remember to turn off auto keying. And if you go to the graph editor now, you can see that we recorded these keyframes. So now you can actually control these keyframes down here by pressing G. And let's just move it to the beginning. So now we have an animation that plays. You know what? Let's smooth this a bit. So let's go back to the graph editor and let's go key, sample keyframes, and then smooth keys. This is explained in the other tutorial. So now let's have a look at our emitter movement. Okay, so one problem is that our domain isn't big enough. So let's just make the domain a little bit bigger. Scale it on the x-axis and the z-axis, I think. So I think there's too much smoke in our scene. So to get rid of the smoke over time, there's the feature called Dissolve. And we can enable this. And now when we press play, we can see that there's a much shorter smoke trail. I actually think this is way too short. So I'm going to increase this to like 25. And now we're going to experience something really interesting. Wait for it. Boop, you see that? The adaptive domain takes a bite of our smoke. Let me just increase the thickness of the smoke so we can see this better. So you see, here is smoke, definitely, right? But if we go like 2 frames and then 1 more, you can see the adaptive domain takes away our smoke. So the goal of the adaptive domain is to just prevent the domain from being too big. So it's always looking for places to shrink and eat away our smoke simulation. And usually that's not a problem. But since we have the dissolve feature enabled, the smoke will try and disappear over time. So these are competing against each other. The dissolve setting is trying to get a smooth smoke fall off, and the adaptive domain is trying to chop away the thinnest part of the smoke that is so thin that it thinks, hey, there's no smoke here, right? We can just not calculate there. So in the adaptive domain settings, you can actually lower the threshold. And I've found a good value to be 0.005 when the dissolve time is set to 25. Okay, so let's have a look. Seems to be working all right. Adaptive domain, not too aggressive. Yeah, that's good. Okay, so I want the fire to stop at the end of the simulation. So right now it goes around like this, and then it sort of freezes here, right? And let's say we want to stop the simulation before that, or stop the fire being emitted. And as you can see here, we have motion until frame 71. So on frame 60, let's go to the physics properties with the smoke emitter selected. And you can see we have this value here called density and fuel. So density controls the thickness of the smoke, and the fuel controls the amount of flame that is being generated. And what's really cool about this is that this behaves like a particle system. So if we cut this off at frame 60, the emitter will stop producing new smoke and fire. And this is really cool because then we can sort of turn off our fireball and it will organically fade away. So to keyframe animate this, right click and insert keyframe on both of these. And let us advance to frame 64. And then let's set these to 0. And then right click, insert another keyframe. So now these are going to fade out from frame 60 to frame 64. So let's reset the domain and let's have a look. Perfect. Okay, so let's have a look at what the motion feels like in our smoke simulation right now. The problem is this red number up here. This means that we're not playing in real time. So to look at our smoke simulation in 100% real time, 30 FPS, we can render out an animation without creating a camera. Let's go to the output properties, and under output, click this folder icon. And on our desktop, where we have saved our stuff, let's make a new folder. Let's call this Flipbook. And I'm going to call this MP4 as well, because we're going to create some MP4 video files. So let's call this fireball_A, and then click accept. And now we're going to set our file format to FFmpeg video, and under encoding, let's set this to MP4. So now what we can do is we can go to the last frame of our simulation, let's say frame 100. So let's set the end to 100 and make sure resolution is set to 50%. You don't need anything more than that. So now to render our viewport as a video file, you can go to View, Viewport Render Animation. And it's going to start rendering our viewport as a video file. And your cursor turns into this frame counter. So now we have a rendered video where you can go render, view animation. And here is our smoke simulation in real time. And what we just did is absolutely crucial, because we need to understand the movement of our simulation. It's very difficult to feel the movement in your scene when your viewport is lagging so much as this one. And it's going to be lagging even more once we start increasing the resolution of our smoke. So, how do we increase the resolution of our smoke? First of all, let's try and increase the resolution divisions to something high, like 128. Now, instead of just pressing play, let me show you something that's really unfortunate. Let's say we stop the simulation, and now let's go back to frame 10 or something, and let's continue. Look at that. This bug is because we haven't enabled the is resumable button. But this button will increase your bake time. So, instead of having to deal with this bug, and instead of using the timeline to simulating our smoke, let's set the cache type to all. So now we get this nice bake all button, and we can set our end frame to 100, and we can press bake to just bake our entire simulation. So now we don't have to be playing in the timeline and hope that everything just plays steady. We can just click this baking button. So here's our bake at 128 resolution divisions. And remember, we can't really just press play because the frame rate is so low. So to render out another flipbook from our viewport, instead of going view, render animation immediately, I recommend that you go over to the output properties and change your file name to fireball B. And this will prevent that we overwrite the previous version. So now you can go view, viewport render animation. Okay, so let's have a look. Instead of going render, view animation all the time, you can actually just go Control F11. There's our new fireball. Okay, so one thing that's actually really cool with Blender is that if you set this to fireball A, without clicking out this other one, you can go to render, view animation, and now you can play both of these. Now we have both of these right next to each other. You can say, okay, so on frame 39, okay, so I think this detail is good. And it's really easy to just compare these two. And that's incredibly powerful, especially if you're doing a smoke bake that lasts for 3 hours and you almost forget what settings you have changed. Then you can just go back and compare these two and say, oh, okay, so I really like the fall off of this tail of the whatever. So this is just really valuable. And I often end up with a lot of versions where I just compare stuff like this all the time. So I'm happy with the motion in this fireball, but I still think it's too low resolution. So how can we increase the resolution of our smoke without changing too much the way it moves? We can use this setting called noise. And it's not really just noise. It's primarily an upres, which is basically a way to increase the resolution. So free our bake, click the noise setting, and let's click bake all and see what it looks like. And this is going to take a while. Okay, so there's our fluid bake complete. Let's have a look. Oh, it's getting quite interesting. So let's have a look at this in real time. And you can click the folder icon just to see how many versions you've made. So let's call this one Fireball C. And you know, if you want to be fancy, you can actually turn off the overlay here, so we only see the smoke. And now we can go view, viewport, render animation. Okay, so let's have a look. So there are two things I want to change right away. First of all, I think the noise strength is way too strong. It just feels like a Photoshop smear layer is just on top of it. It doesn't feel like it has any depth anymore. And I also think the fireball is too thick. We want to make it thinner. You can enable your overlay again, which is Alt-Shift-Z. Select the emitter and go to physics properties. To make the fireball thinner, we can change a setting in the flow source called surface emission. Higher value results in emission further away from the mesh surface. So let's set this to 0.5 and we're going to get a much more slim fireball. And let's go free all. Let's lower the strength of our noise. Let's do 0.4 or 0.3. You know what? Let's go ahead and set the upres factor to 3 because I think this is going to be our final bake for this tutorial. This is going to take a while. Let's go ahead and click bake all. Just about to be finished. Oh, there our smoke bake finished. All bake complete. 446.37. I'm just so curious what that number is. I wonder if it's the amount of seconds. I'm not sure. So let's have a look. Ooh, very interesting. This is going to look really great. I think we're ready to do some shading. Let's just have a look at this one, even though it looks really cool already. So let's go render the viewport animation. And by the way, this is 100 frames of smoke simulation, which is absolutely way too much if you just want to learn like the basics of this, because the longer the smoke just keeps on simulating, the bake times are just really piling up towards the end. So I highly recommend, if you just want to test out smoke simulation, just do like 30 or 40 frames or 20. It's much more helpful than sitting around waiting for a 100 frame bake. But I thought we could do it in this tutorial just to see an entire smoke simulation. So now let's view our animation. Yeah, let's do some shading. So now we're going to add our own custom fire material. We are going to be using the brand new Cycles X render engine. So go to the render properties and set the render engine to Cycles and set the device to GPU. You might want to check your CUDA if you have that available. So first of all, let's make a camera. So let's go Shift A, camera, and let's go view, align active camera to view. And then you can right click and adjust the focal length. You just zoom out a little bit. And let's press G and Y to move it on the Y axis. Let's move it down by pressing G. Yeah, perfect. So let's go ahead and see what this looks like in render view. And you can turn off the overlay if you like. And if things gets really slow and unresponsive, you can press Ctrl B and just mark a selection of where you want to render. And this is a really nice way to just make things more responsive in the viewport. So since we won't be baking any more smoke just in the nearest future, we can change this editor type to shader editor. And now we can select your domain. And behind this menu, you can see, there is a node. And this node is called principled volume, and it's really powerful. It's a nice way to extract a lot of the data from our smoke simulation into the material output. But there are some details here that are sort of hidden that we want to try and extract. So first of all, let's set our black body intensity. This is going to be the brightness of our smoke. You see it stops at 1, but you can actually increase this to like 5 or 20 or 50. Now our scene looks a little bit washed out. So let's go to the world properties, set our background strength to 0, but now it's like super pitch black. So just to give a little bit of highlight to our smoke, since it now disappeared completely, let's make a lamp. So Shift A and let's go light point. And you can see it already interacts with our volumetric. So let's move it on the Z axis, so G and Z. So now it's above our smoke, and then let's move it a little bit on the Y-axis. So now we have this light sort of like behind our smoke a little bit. And let's go to the object data properties and increase the power of our light. Let's do 100 watts. No, let's do 1000 watts. There we go. And now you can go view cameras, active camera, which is numpad 0, to get back to the camera view. So now we can see we have this highlight on our smoke. And I think it's a really nice way to just get some detail in the smoke. But there's a problem here. See this blob? This isn't really a detailed fire. But if we select our domain, there is plenty of data here. It's just that we haven't extracted it yet. We are going to use a node called volume info. Shift A, input, volume info. If you want to see what this node looks like, you can hold down Control and you can grab this one. You can put it into the density. And here's our density. And then you can hold down Control and let's check out the flame, temperature, and this color one is really weird. I'm not sure what that is. Okay, so let's see the density. And now you can actually see that we can see our emitter here, and we don't want that. So in the outliner, you can click this little camera icon, which will disable it in renders. So we can still see it in viewport, but it won't appear in the final render. So select our domain again, and let's hold down Control and change this one back to the principled volume. And now we're going to use this flame output. So let me just use Control B here to isolate this part. So let's take this flame output and plug it into the black body intensity. And right away it gets way too weak. And that is because we had a value of 50 here, right? So we can use a math node to get this back up. So go Shift A, converter, math. And let's change this from add to multiply and set the value to 50. So now this node is multiplying the flame output by 50 and then sending it through the black body intensity. As you can see, we're getting just a little bit more detail. But there's one more trick we can do, which is insane. Let's make some space here, and let's go Shift A, converter, color ramp. And let's put the color ramp between the flame and the multiply, and it will automatically connect. And let's change this from linear to constant. And now everything goes black. But with the magical power of the Cycles X responsive viewport, we can now see this in real time, and this is fantastic. So let's select this one, and let's just look at that. How cool is this? We can control where the fire is going to end. And this isn't really the most powerful part yet, because now we can control it like this, right? And if we press this plus icon, we can make another black color stop, and we can move it to the right of the white one. So we just get this slice of white. And now we're getting some really interesting details just from this data that is already available in the smoke simulation. So right now it's just really hard, just so we can see the effect better. So instead of having this set to constant, let's set it to B-spline. Let's tweak this a little bit. And I like to have it like this. Let's just zoom in like way too far. So here you can see, let's select this black one. You can see that we're making sort of like a glow. So we're keeping it sharp, but it's sort of glowing. Let's look at this one. This is going to be sort of the brightness. This is getting really dark, so let's increase the brightness of everything. Let's set the multiply node to 150, for example. Now there's one more thing I want to change, and that is the fall off. Because right now, this fireball is sort of, it has the same strength all the way. And we want to make it strong here, and then just weaker to the end. Remember when we used that dissolve feature earlier? That makes the smoke really thick in the beginning, and then it will sort of fade out, right? So that means that this density value will be really thick in the beginning, and then it will go thinner towards the end. So that means that if we take the density and plug it into the multiply, we can make a flame that starts bright and then becomes weaker. But now it's already too weak, so let's take this old multiply node and duplicate it by pressing Shift D. And you can see this has a value of 150, so we can just slap this on there, and now we're back to a strength of 150. And we also want to duplicate our color ramp, so press Shift D to duplicate, and then click this little menu and reset it. And now we can drag this on top of here. So now we have two color ramps, one in the density and this old one in the flame. So here's where the cool thing happens. Let's take this color ramp, which takes the density into account, and let's flip it in this menu. And now we can take this slider, make this fall off, look really interesting. And we can make it even smoother by setting it to B-spline. This is getting really cool. Let's actually increase the strength by something incredible, like 500. Yeah, maybe 400. Okay, so let's offset this a little bit by using a math node. So go Shift A, converter, math, and let's just have this set to add, place it between the density and the color ramp. And now you can hold down Shift and you can sort of drag this, and it will adjust where this color ramp is placed. And the reason why we're adding this slider is that if you were to increase the resolution of your smoke, let's say you wanted a upres value of 5 instead of 3, this shader is not going to look exactly the same as it does now, because the smoke has more detail. This add shader is a really nice way to compensate for that. I really like how the smoke just... Oh, what? Oh. I thought I lost everything. So that's the danger of Blender Alpha, it's that it can crash anytime. So I really like the fall off on this one. And we can actually increase the power a little bit more. Let's do 600. Now that we have a camera, instead of going viewport render animation, let's go render. Let's just render a still image. Okay, so this is coming together. Okay, so the default setting in Cycles X is 4000 samples. You don't need 4000 samples for smoke simulation because the denoiser is fantastic. So instead of rendering this at 4000 samples, which is going to take a minute, let's just go to the render properties. And this is going to look a little bit different in Blender version 2.93, but the key takeaway is this. Let's set the samples to 32 and let's have the denoiser enabled. And that's basically all you need to have, because now when we press render, F12, you can see that this render takes 4 seconds. First of all, that's insane. And second of all, it looks really smooth. We're doing it in 50% of HD resolution, and I think this looks great. So let's render this as an animation, but we do not want to render this as an FFmpeg video. We want to render it as an EXR sequence. Set the file format to EXR. And this does not create a video file because it's an image format, so it's just going to create a lot of still images, and that's perfect. So let's set the color depth to half, we don't need full, and let's set the codec to DWAA, which is a lossy codec, and it's fantastic. It keeps your files super small and it has all the information you need. You can't tell the difference between the lossy and the lossless one. Okay, so let's click the folder icon and let's create a new folder called render EXR. And let's call this it's Fireball D, that's perfect. Except Blender usually crashes the first time I render. So let's just try it. Let's go render and render animation. Okay, so it looks good. It doesn't crash. We're actually just at 2 seconds per frame, which, I mean, if you told me 10 years ago that we will be rendering smoke simulation with like real ray tracing in 2 seconds per frame, okay, so we're gonna crash, and that's a good exercise. It's a good learning opportunity. Okay, this usually happens. No worries. Oh yeah, so let's just open it back up. And one interesting thing about after we crash, the render settings sometimes gets reset. So remember to turn on the noise threshold and max samples 32, and let's turn on the denoiser. And in the output properties, since we have already rendered 14 frames, instead of rendering them again, we can turn off overwrite, and now we can go render animation, and it's going to start where it left off on frame 15. Perfect. So this is one of the reasons why we render as an image sequence and not as a video file. Because if this would have happened in a video file, we would have lost our entire render. I've actually never experienced that Blender has crashed while recording before, which is really impressive actually. So while we're rendering, just quick reminder that there is a Patreon if you want to support the channel. some project files, some stuff to tinker with if you're into Blender and that sort of stuff. It really helps me out. Oh, the render is finished. Let's go render, view animation. I'm actually surprised that this plays smooth when it's like EXR sequences. So the reason that we rendered this as an EXR sequence is that if you look at this fireball, you can just right click and you can hold your mouse over these bright areas. This is like 30 times brighter than the brightest red. And that is because we are using the EXR format, because it supports these floating values. And this is a really nice way to create glow. This means that we can just slap some glow on this entire thing, even the smoke, and it's going to look really good. So to do the compositing, let's set the editor type to compositor. And it's really empty here because we have to click use nodes and then backdrop. Here's our render layer and here's our composite output. So if we press F12 now, this is our render layer and the data sort of goes all the way this into the composite. So what we're looking at here is the composite. So to view the render in the background as a backdrop, you can press Ctrl Shift and then click on the render layer, and this will create a viewer. And then you can hold down Alt and middle mouse button to move this background around. So you know what, let's right click on this one and click Join Areas and click on the one you want to disappear. And let's add a glare node. So let's go Shift A, Filter, Glare. And let's just drop this on the composite, and then you can press Ctrl Shift to view the glare node. So there will be a data stream going from the render layers into the glare and then into the composite and the viewer. Here we can change all kinds of glow settings. Let's set it to fog glow. Let's set it to high. And so this mix slider is the glow intensity, where -1 is original image only, 0 is exact 50-50 mix, and 1 is processed image only. To zoom this image in, you can actually open this menu, and under view, let's set the zoom to 2 times. So there's one problem here, and that is that the glare is only applied to this part of the fire. And we want to set the threshold to 0, so that even the smoke gets a glow filter applied. And let's set the size to 9. Let's lower the mix to -0.9. So we have this really subtle glow effect. And now what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate this glare node. And then make sure you connect this to the viewer as well. So now you have 2 glare nodes, where this one goes into this one, and this one goes to the composite or the final render. But if we now wanted to see what our smoke simulation looks like on frame 60, nothing happens. This doesn't update. And that is because we would have to render it out again. So now it updates. This is the reason why we already did the render. So we can just import the image sequence rendered in EXR supporting this high dynamic range format, because now we can go Shift A, Input, Image, and then click Open, and then find your render EXR, and then select all of these, which is the entire image sequence of 100 frames, open image, and now you can hold down Control and drag it from the render layer over to this image. So now we can go to any frame and it will composite that frame immediately. And the reason why we're doing this compared to using the render layers is because when we're going to render our final video file from Blender, we don't want to render the volumetrics and the fire and the smoke and everything. We just want to composite this pre-rendered EXR sequence. So that makes it much easier to, for example, change the amount of glow or change the size of the glow or change whatever you want to do in the compositor without re-rendering the smoke, only re-exporting the EXR sequence as a video file, which is perfect. So the reason why we duplicated this glare node is because this glare node is set to high to get this really nice fall off. And then this one, if we set this to medium, it will be slightly bigger. So now let's set this to -0.95, for example. No, let's do -0.92. Perfect. So let's render this out as a video. So if we go to the output properties and set our file format back to FFmpeg video, and under encoding, let's set it to MP4. Let's set our output quality to perceptually lossless, so it's really high quality. And then let's create a new folder by pressing the folder icon. And let's call this exports MP4. So this is going to be our final render. So let's call this Fireball Beauty 1. So this is going to be just our beauty render. However, let's say I want to render this image right now. It will still render the actual smoke. And this is the thing that we're trying to prevent to save some time, because this is a 5-second render. That's actually insane. CycleSex is just almost making this workflow unnecessary. But for like bigger smoke simulations, this is going to be a huge time saver. So what you can do is you can right click on this render layer and toggle node mute, hotkey M. So now you just mute this, and since this project file no longer has any active render layers, now when you press F12, it will just render the compositor right away, and it does it in less than a second. Let's just save our file, and now when you go render animation, it's going to render your smoke simulation really fast, less than 1 second per frame, because now we're just rendering the glow from the compositor, not the actual smoke simulation. Okay, so here's our final result. Perhaps we could have added more glow if we wanted to. So I've tried my best to just explain every step of the way to get here, but there are some things you can do to get the smoke simulation even better. And I think we're about to enter the advanced part of this tutorial. Let's start out by creating a gradient background, but any diffuse material will render quite slowly. So let's give the plane an emission material with a gradient texture set to quadratic sphere. Then add a mapping node with a texture coordinate set to object. Now you can move the gradient around using location sliders in the mapping node. Here's the node setup I ended up using. But now we get a lot of banding, so let's do something weird. Remember we used denoising on this smoke? Let's add noise on top of that. I like to use a cloud texture with a really tiny scale, and then combine it using a mix node set to overlay. Use the mix factor to control the intensity, and to animate this fake sensor noise, go to the texture z-axis and type the expression #frame to get unique noise each frame. Here's the node setup if you want to take a screenshot. This next step is not really necessary, but if you happen to have the studio version of Davinci Resolve 17, you can import the raw EXR sequence, and in the Fusion tab, use the nodes optical flow and vector motion blur and set the blur scale to 0.5. Then export it again as EXR and import this to Blender. Now you can replace the raw render and see if the fake motion blur works as intended. Let's get back to our smoke emitter. It needs more life. We can add a displace modifier with the texture set to clouds and change the coordinates to global. Add a subdivision surface modifier and move it to the top of the modifier stack. Make sure the fluid modifier is at the bottom. Now our fireball will have a more organic surface when it moves around. But why does our fireball have to be a ball? In the SVG tutorial, you can learn how to import vector objects to Blender. And if you convert this to mesh, it can be set as a smoke emitter. So if you watch both these tutorials, this is your chance to just completely light up that like button. Now for the final render, let's import some 3D assets. We'll take this katana model from Polyhaven, then we'll get this SWAT guy character from Ixamo, and give him some sword fighter motion capture. In Blender, position the katana in the hand of the character. Select the bone that controls the wrist, parent the katana to the mocap armature with the parent set to bone, and now we're getting somewhere. Now separate the blade from the handle, so we can set the blade as a smoke emitter. Add glowing eyes, asphalt, mountains, pipes, rocks, barrels, a camera rig, some camera shake, and then turn off the lights.